Um, what's the consequence of stereotyping and prejudice for people who have to face that in their everyday lives? So, what we're going to actually look at is begin with a very simple question, which is how do members of stereotype groups see themselves? And in particular, we're going to start with one of the first questions that was asked about this. Do members of stereotype groups have lower self esteem? There were many models that actually suggest that they do. One of those models is one of the oldest models of the self concept. It's called the looking glass self. And that model suggests that the way we come to feel about ourselves, the way we learn what we're like, the way we develop our self esteem, is we take the view of ourselves that other people have of us. Other people are, in a sense, like a mirror. And what other people think of us is how we come to see ourselves. It's been a model that's been around since the beginning of the 20th century. And it suggests that if people are regularly stereotyped and they're prejudiced against those people, that is, other people see them negatively based on stereotypes, they will come to feel worse about themselves. Um, we also talked earlier in the class about Al Port's classic book, The Nature of Prejudice. And in that book, he has a whole chapter devoted to what he calls the internalization of prejudice. That is, that people come to believe the prejudice that others hold of themselves. Um, and so both of these important models suggest that people who are members of stereotype groups may have lower self esteem. But what does the data look like? And Crocker and Major, and Jenny Crocker, the first author on this paper, is here at Ohio State. So you might have an opportunity to take a class with her later. What they did, though, is they looked at the data despite these models. And what they found was remarkably consistent across groups is that members of stigmatized and stereotyped groups do not have lower self esteem. Blacks don't have lower self esteem than whites. In general, women don't have lower self esteem than men. You can take any ethnic group you want, Latinx people, members of indigenous groups, whatever stereotype group you want. You can look at people who have big facial scars, have facial disfigurement. They don't have lower self esteem. And in fact, it's hard to find a group that's stereotyped that actually does have lower self esteem. And it's remarkably consistent across groups. If these theories, though, suggest that we get our views from others, why don't people with who are regularly experience prejudice and discrimination, why don't they have lower self esteem? Well, Crocker and Major argued that there are three explanations why members of stereotype groups do not have lower self esteem. The first one comes out of research on social identity theory. We talked a little bit about this earlier in class, but the basic idea is that one way you might not have lower self esteem is rather than comparing yourself to other people who don't face prejudice and discrimination, you might be more likely to compare yourself to other people in your own group. And that wouldn't cause the group as a whole to have lower self esteem because their basis of comparisons are within the group. They don't compare themselves to others, they compare themselves to who aren't in their group, they compare themselves with people in their own group. They also argued that members of stigmatized groups and stereotype groups may disengage from their performance in those particular domains where they face stereotyping. They can just say, that's not an important part of how I think about myself. They can remove that prejudice and stereotype from being a source of negative evaluations of the self if they just don't value and even if they value it, that they don't stake how they feel about themselves based on how they're being evaluated in those situations. They disengage from that. That's not what makes them feel they have self esteem or not. And lastly, members of stereotype groups who receive negative feedback can make attributions to prejudice. They can say, well, the reason I didn't do well here is that person was prejudiced. And that sort of attribution of prejudice should make them realize, well, it's not really me, it's the other person. And that should blunt the effects of that prejudice and discrimination they face on affecting their self-esteem. Now, they did a number of different studies to examine these different explanations why people who face prejudice and discrimination may not have lower self-esteem. One of the classics I'm going to tell you about is Crocker and Major did this with a couple of their graduate students. And what they looked at is how people respond to positive and negative feedback, and how that affects how they're feeling about themselves afterwards. So the participants in this study were either white or black, and they're all told that the study was about friendship development, and they were paired with another student who was white. They didn't, just come out and say the person was white. What they actually did is they had people exchange IDs, so that they had some idea who the person was, their student IDs, and like your Buck ID, these student IDs had people's pictures on it. So they clearly knew that, or they clearly thought that the person they interacted with was white or black. And what wait a second. That was study 1 from this paper. Study 2, they don't know the race actually of the person that they're interacting with. They just thought that they were paired with another student who was white. So it wasn't white or black. They get the ID of the student, and they know that the person they're interacting with is white. Then participants fill out a self-description of things they like and they dislike, and their strengths and weaknesses, which were supposedly given to the other person. Now, the other person's in the room next door, and there's a mirror in between the two rooms. And the idea is that the person could see through that. It's a two-way mirror. The person could see through that and see them or not. But the blinds on the mirror were either up or they were down. So if the blinds are up, then the white person who's evaluating them can see them, or presumably can see them. If the blinds are down, then the other person presumably doesn't know their race. They know the other person is white, but the other person, when the blinds are down, presumably does not know their race. And then participants got feedback from their partner that basically indicated they could see them becoming friends with the person or not. So they basically said, well, based on what they said here, I think I could become their friend. Or based on what they said here, I think I really couldn't become their friends. And then the participants in the studies made attributions to the partner's feedback. And they could, those attributions could be attributions to, they looked particularly at attributions to prejudice, and then they had all the participants fill out a state self-esteem scale. How were they feeling about themselves at the moment? Let's first look at their attributions to prejudice. What you see when black people thought that the other person knew their race and gave them positive feedback, they see relatively low prejudice. But when the person said they thought that they couldn't be friends, they saw the person as having quite high prejudice. When they were unseen, there's a little bit of a tendency with negative feedback to still think that they were prejudiced. The person shouldn't have known their race, so you wouldn't expect high attributions to prejudice, but there's a little bit there even when they're unseen. But the effect is much stronger when they are seen. Whites basically don't make any attributions to prejudice, which kind of makes sense. Okay, but let's go on and look at the results for self-esteem, and these are really interesting. What you see is that when people get negative feedback, when blacks get negative feedback and they're unseen, and that means the person doesn't have a reason to think that they're black, and the other person says they can't see themselves becoming friends, they take a real hit to their self-esteem. Whites don't have any hits to their self-esteem. They actually, though, feel real positive when they're seen and the person wants to be their friend. Presumably, they think, oh, the person saw me, likes me, wants to be my friend, so they feel better about themselves. Interestingly and unexpected in this study, blacks who are seen and are given positive feedback actually report lower self-esteem as well. The explanation here is really that it's probably feeling a little bit condescending. When the person says, oh yeah, I could be their friends, when they can see them and they're black, they wonder if they're really being honest, and that condescension probably makes them feel a little bit worse about themselves. But the big effect here is when they're unseen, or what the predicted effect, where you see attributions to prejudice, is when they're seen and they get negative feedback, they don't, even though the person gives them negative feedback, they don't feel bad about themselves. Okay, so let's summarize these results from Crocker and Major and what they found. First, members of stigmatized groups do not tend to have lower self-esteem. This is probably at least partially due to making social comparisons within their group. This part of Crocker and Major model has hardly been tested, however, but it's consistent with the social identity theory we talked about earlier. It's probably at least partly due to disengagement with the stigmatized domain, and there's a fair bit of evidence for this mechanism. I haven't really talked about it today, but there is a fair bit of that mechanism and evidence for that mechanism, and it's also probably due to attributions to prejudice. And there's pretty strong evidence for this mechanism, attributional ambiguity in those situations. That's what they call those situations when somebody might be evaluating you in a prejudiced way, but you're not sure, can undermine even positive effects from positive feedback, which we saw in the last study we just talked about. Okay, but let's think a little bit more about these perceptions of discrimination. What we see is when it's a one-off in one situation and somebody evaluates you negatively, it's going to be pretty tough. When somebody evaluates you negatively and feels and rates you not so positively, you can make attributions to prejudice, and that can make you feel better about yourself. But what happens over time when you make attributions to discrimination? Is it still protective? Branscombe and her colleagues argued that it may not be. And the basic idea is, although you could say, in an instance like in the study we just described, somebody doesn't want to be friends with you, that's because you're prejudiced. But what happens if over time that happens over and over and over again, which is true for members of stereotyped groups? What happens when people face that sort of discrimination over and over again? It might be due to prejudice, but it still kind of sucks. And they proposed a new model, which looks at attributions to discrimination, or perceptions of discrimination, and how that would affect the way that people think about themselves over time. And the model basically suggests that willingness to make attributions to prejudice can lead to negative feelings about the self, but that's buffered because it actually allows you to identify more with your group that you're a part of, because you can see the commonness of facing prejudice and discrimination. When you make those attributions to prejudice, yeah, in the short run, it's protective, but in the long run, it would probably make you feel bad about yourself. But in the long run, it also helps you identify with your group. So these two effects balance over time. So when you think of looking at members of stereotype groups, do they have lower self-esteem? No. But that's a balancing between identifying with your group, which helps your self-esteem, and recognizing that you have to face discrimination all the time that sucks. And those two things actually end up being about a net zero effect overall. Interestingly, they predict, which makes a lot of sense, if you make over time lots of attributions to prejudice, that's going to lead you to have hostility against the groups that's prejudiced against you. So that's the full model of what they were trying to say. And I think over time you'd realize, although it's protective to make attributions to prejudice in the moment, over time that's going to basically lead you to realize, hey, that's kind of sucks that there is this unfairness and injustice that people are being prejudiced against me. That can be offset, though, by identification with your group. So in this particular study, when Branscombe and her colleagues wanted to look at this, they recruited a fairly large group of Black participants. Then they had them report on a number of different things. Attributions to prejudice across a wide range of everyday situations, past experience of racial discrimination, hostility towards white, group identification with being Black, and two well-being measures, both personal well-being and collective well-being. And what they found was evidence really quite consistent with their model. The more people make attributions to prejudice across a lot of situations in their everyday life, the more they identify with their group. The more Blacks identified with being Black as an important part of who they are. Also, the more hostility they had towards white. But this effect, this willingness to make attributions to prejudice, tended to predict negative collective self-esteem and personal well-being measures, how people were feeling about themselves, but that was offset by the positive feelings that they had for their group. So this model really isn't inconsistent with the stuff that we saw with Crocker and Major and their colleagues. Blacks did not have lower self-esteem, but there is this complex story over time that identifying with your group helps overcome the realization that it really is kind of sucky that you have to face prejudice and discrimination all the time. Okay, so we've talked about people wanting to acknowledge prejudice as a way to overcome negative evaluations in a situation, but there's also this persistent finding that people sometimes don't want to acknowledge prejudice. And it comes from research on what's called the person-group discrimination discrepancy. And what this basic finding is that research studying perceptions of prejudice have noticed a tendency to report that members of their group experience prejudice regularly, but they themselves do not. And the first classic study of this was done by Faye Crosby in 1984. And what she did is she went into an organization, and the organization, it was a business, and there weren't a lot of women in the business at the time. About 10% were women. And they looked at women's view of their pay at work and whether women are paid equally to men. So it was really about, do women get equal pay for equal work? Okay. What women reported is that they were satisfied with their own work conditions and that they are paid fairly for their work. So if you ask them about themselves, they would say, yes, I'm paid fairly and I'm satisfied with my situation here at work. Women also reported, and this was the actual truth, that women in general are discriminated against and receive less pay for the same work than men. How can both be true? Well, it turns out that both can't both be true because they ask it for every single woman in the organization. Crosby asked this for every single woman in the organization when she did this work, and this is how she described it. Whoops. Here then is the conundrum. The employed women of Newton were discriminated against. They showed a keen awareness of sex discrimination in general, and yet they showed few signs of feeling personally discriminated against. It seems as if virtually every working woman imagined herself to be the lucky exception to the general plight. And she asked, what accounts for this self deception? Um, so really what happened at this company, Newton, which that's not the actual name of the place, that the business that she was looking at, she didn't actually reveal the actual name of the place. She called it Newton. Women were discriminated. They didn't get equal pay for equal work. But, and they recognized that that was true, that women in general don't. But every single woman, just about, in the company reported that they themselves weren't discriminated against, which, of course, both of these things can't be true. So, what accounts for this? What are the sources of this person's situation, discrimination, discrepancy? Notice that this is a real problem for people who want to get people to work together to fight against injustice. If everybody thinks, yeah, there's injustice out there, but I don't feel it, there's going to be less motivation for people to act out of their own self-interest to fight injustice. They're not recognizing their own injustice, the injustice that they themselves are facing. So what are the sources of this? So Taylor, Wright, Magdum, and Lalonde did a very interesting study in Montreal. They looked at 4 different immigrant groups. All of them faced discrimination. All of them showed the person situation discrimination discrepancy. They thought their group was discriminated against, each one of these immigrant groups, but they thought they themselves were not. And what they argued is that people tend to minimize personal discrimination as one possibility that could create it. They also suggest that maybe you could exaggerate group discrimination. And you could have a bunch of cognitive biases. Now, we know the exaggeration of group discrimination in a number of cases actually is unlikely. Like in the Crosby study we just talked about, women recognized that women were underpaid compared to men, but they actually underestimated the amount that even other women were underpaid, and of course grossly underestimated the amount that they themselves were underpaid. So it seems that minimization of personal discrimination certainly is a possibility, and no, there could be cognitive biases that are going on as people are thinking about it. But I would argue that some of the theories we've talked about help us explain this phenomenon as well. This discrepancy actually could arise from similar processes to those described by Crocker and Major and Branscombe, Schmidt, and Harvey. And how could that be the case? Well, on one hand, when you think about how people are doing in a given situation, people might want to make attributions to prejudice for the group as a whole to explain it, and might be reluctant to think about making that attribution to prejudice for themselves because of the long-term consequences that Brandt, Schmidt, and Harvey talks about. Because of that, you actually, if you think of Branscombe, Schmidt, and Harvey's model, where there's long-term negative consequences of attribution to prejudice, but that should primarily be true for individual prejudice. On the other hand, you get positive benefits by identifying with the group. Well, if you engage in this personal situation discrimination discrepancy, you actually don't get the negative consequences from personally seeing discrimination, but you do get the positive consequences from seeing the group as a whole as discriminated against. So what does this lead us to as we're thinking about perceptions of prejudice? Perceptions of prejudice are not really straightforward, despite what I've left the not out of that sentence. Perceptions of prejudice are rarely straightforward. They can drive in-group identification, as we saw with the Branscombe-Schmidt article. They can make it, they can be missed for the self, perceptions of prejudice. We can see them for the group, we can miss it from the self. The impact of discrimination is not quite as easy to dismiss when you consider it across time and across situations. So when we think about perceptions of prejudice, yes, attributions of prejudice can be a real salve in the moment. It can help you overcome the negative feelings that you have in a given moment. But over time, perceptions of prejudice, the real benefit may be driving in group identification, and you may miss the prejudice for yourself because of the negative implications of thinking you always have to face discrimination and prejudice every moment. And the impact of discrimination just isn't quite so easy to avoid by attributions to prejudice when you think about it across time and across situations.